They said a drifting Navy veteran and his German Shepherd were just passing through, carrying nothing but an old truck, a torn map, and the weight of too many winters. But on one frozen evening in Harbor Falls, a 96-year-old woman collapsed inside her lonely radio shop, and the two souls she had never met became the ones who saved her life. What followed wasn't luck. It was something quieter, something shaped by grace. A fading radio came alive again. A forgotten town found its voice. And a wounded soldier learned that purpose sometimes waits in the places we never planned to stop. This isn't just a story about survival in a storm. It's about faith, second chances, and the way kindness can rebuild an entire community. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that warm the heart. The soldier wandering through the snow, the winter wind swept along the coastline of Harbor Falls, carrying needles of frost across the empty street. Ethan Cole guided his rust-red pickup into town, its engine coughing like an old dog refusing to quit. He was a man in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a posture that revealed years of discipline carved into bone and instinct. A faint limp marked his left leg. It never bothered him enough to complain, but the rhythm of his steps betrayed an old injury that military doctors once described as manageable if he learned to live with pain. He had. His face bore the sharp lines of someone who had seen too much. A square jaw covered in short, dark stubble, storm-gray eyes that had once been steady as rifle sights now carried a quiet heaviness, as though every winter he drove through added another layer to the weight he already carried. The Navy SEALs had shaped him, but the missions he never talked about had hollowed something behind his calm exterior. Beside him sat Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat. The dog's ears were tall and alert, and a faint scar cut across his right foreleg, barely visible beneath the harness marked, "Service dog, do not pet." Ranger was disciplined, steady, and eerily perceptive, traits shaped by trauma as much as training. He had been with Ethan through hospital rooms, nights of insomnia, and endless highways. To outsiders, he looked like a working dog. To Ethan, he was the only thing that kept silence from swallowing him whole. Harbor Falls wasn't supposed to be anything more than a stop for gas and coffee. Ethan didn't plan routes anymore. He didn't plan much at all. The road kept him moving. The memories kept him from stopping. But Ranger's head lifted suddenly. The dog stiffened, muscles tight beneath his winter coat, ears twisting towards something Ethan could not yet hear. The sound of the wind was too loud, too constant, too much like the static that still sometimes filled Ethan's ears when he lay awake at night. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan murmured. Ranger didn't blink. He stared down the road toward the dim, flickering glow of a lone shop at the far end of the street. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. A sign hung crooked above the door, Harbor Falls Radio and Post. The paint was peeling, the windows frosted over, the wooden steps half buried under snow. An old antenna crouched on the roof, thin as a skeleton, still braving the cold like it had one last duty to perform. Ranger gave a low, uneasy whine. "All right," Ethan sighed. "We'll take a look." He parked by the curb and stepped out into the wind. The cold bit instantly at his cheeks. He pulled his navy winter coat tighter, the fabric stiff with age, and Ranger hopped out beside him, paws crunching into the snow. The street was silent except for the distant roar of the ocean and the soft hum leaking from the shop window, a radio broadcast so faint it could have been decades old. Inside, Margaret Hayes stood hunched over the wooden counter. She was 96, her small frame swallowed by a thick wool cardigan the color of oatmeal. Her white hair was braided loosely down her back, strands escaping like pale threads of smoke. Her face, creased with nearly a century of winters, carried a gentleness that outlived hardship. But her movements were unsteady. Every breath she drew came with a shallow tremor. Margaret had lived alone since her husband passed. The radio shop was her last anchor to the world. Its dusty shelves, its postcards pinned under glass, its humming equipment older than many of the town's residents. But age had been catching up quickly. For weeks she had been battling sickness, too weak to fetch groceries, too dizzy to walk far. Yet every day she tried to keep her radio station alive, believing someone out there still needed to hear a voice during winter. Now, as she reached for the dial to adjust the weather report for fishermen offshore, a wave of vertigo slammed into her. The room spun, her fingers slipped, her vision flickered like the failing neon sign outside. "Oh, not now," she whispered, but even her voice sounded distant to her own ears. She grabbed the edge of the counter, knuckles white, but her grip gave way. The floorboards rose toward her like a cold, unforgiving tide. The little stove hissed softly in the corner, the only witness to her collapse. Margaret's breathing faltered. She reached out for something, anything, her frail hand stretching toward the radio's faint glow, but it was too far. The world turned to muffled static. Outside, snow whipped hard against the windows, and Ranger heard it. The dog's head snapped toward the glass. He let out one deep, urgent bark, short, sharp, a warning born of instinct and duty. Ethan stopped mid-step. His heart kicked once in his chest. Something was wrong. He knew that bark. He had heard it on nights when seconds meant life or death. He turned toward the shop, and that was where the chapter ended, on the edge of a decision, with a 96-year-old woman lying on the cold wooden floor, and a soldier and his dog somewhere outside in the storm, perhaps seconds too late. The faint radio and the fragile breath, the bell above the wooden door was still trembling when Ethan dropped to his knees beside the fallen woman. The shop smelled of dust, cold wood, and the faint metallic hum of the old circuits still running. Margaret Hayes lay curled on her side, her thin white hair fanned across the floor like scattered threads of frost. Ethan placed 2 fingers at her neck. A pulse, weak but present, her breathing shallow, dragging, her skin cold. "Stay with me, ma'am," he murmured, though he didn't know if she could hear. "You're not done yet." Ranger stood rigid a few feet away, ears pinned forward, tail low but not tucked. The German shepherd's gaze stayed fixed on Margaret, the way he used to watch soldiers injured on extraction nights, alert, measuring danger, deciding where to place himself. Ethan grabbed the nearest blanket from the counter, a knitted thing with unraveling corners, and tucked it around her trembling shoulders. Then he dialed the town's emergency line. A woman answered, her voice brisk, local, accustomed to winter accidents. Within minutes, the rumble of a small ambulance echoed down the street. The paramedic who stepped out was a broad man in his 50s named Tom Calder, wearing a thick navy parka and carrying a worn medical bag. He had a salt and pepper beard trimmed close to his jaw and gentle brown eyes that softened each time he spoke. Years of lifting stretchers had rounded his shoulders, but there was a calm steadiness in him that suggested a past spent navigating the harsh winters of Maine. He nodded once at Ethan, then crouched to examine Margaret. "Pulse is thready," Tom murmured. "Cold exposure and exhaustion. Let's move her." Ethan lifted her with careful strength, feeling just how little she weighed. Ranger followed so close his whiskers brushed Ethan's coat. Inside the small-town clinic, fluorescent lights hummed above beige walls. The place smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee. Margaret lay in a narrow bed, wrapped in warm blankets and connected to monitors that beeped softly. Her breath steadied but stayed thin. When she finally opened her eyes, she did so slowly, as though waking from a dream she had not chosen. Ethan stood beside her, hands in the pockets of his winter coat. Ranger lay near the foot of the bed, paws crossed neatly, head lifted in quiet vigilance. Margaret blinked twice before focusing on Ethan. Up close, her features were more defined than he remembered, soft wrinkles lining her cheeks like folded parchment, pale eyes dulled by fatigue yet holding a spark of curiosity. "You're the man from the door," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am. Ethan Cole." He gestured toward the dog. "And that's Ranger. He's the one who heard you fall." A faint smile touched her lips. "Good ears on that one." Ranger thumped his tail once, politely. Tom entered again, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Hayes, you're dehydrated, undernourished, and your chest x-ray shows the start of a mild pneumonia. Another night alone in that cold building, and things might have gone differently." Margaret turned her eyes toward Ethan again, gratitude softening her face. She had lived so long with silence that the sudden presence of someone who cared enough to carry her through the snow felt unreal, like a kindness out of the past. By morning, the storm outside eased. The doctor, a stern but attentive woman named Dr. Nora Connolly, discharged Margaret with strict orders and a list of medications. She was in her late 60s, short, stocky, with silver hair cut in a blunt bob and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She spoke with the clipped tone of someone who treated every patient like family, whether they liked it or not. "You need heat, proper meals, less time climbing those rickety stools in that shop of yours," Dr. Connolly instructed. "And someone to keep an eye on you for at least a week." Margaret chuckled weakly. "You volunteering, doctor?" The doctor shot a look at Ethan, who stood awkwardly near the coat rack. Looks to me like you already found help. Ethan straightened. Just passing through, ma'am. Not anymore, Dr. Connolly replied. If you bring her home, you watch her. Her house isn't safe. Water damage, gas line rusting, wiring from the 60s. On the drive back, Margaret sat beside him in the truck, bundled in a thick blanket Tom had insisted she take. Her hands were fragile but warm now, resting on her lap. Ranger sat in the back seat, head between the front seats as if supervising the road. Margaret studied Ethan's profile, the rough stubble, the tired eyes, the quiet posture of a man who did not ask for belonging because he no longer expected it. You saved me, she said softly. He shook his head. Dog did. Well, she countered, if you and that dog saved a 96-year-old woman in the middle of winter, the least I can do is borrow you for a few days. Ethan tried not to smile, but it reached him anyway. I don't know how long I'm staying. Long enough to fix a roof, I hope, she said. It leaks straight onto my radio wires. Arthur, my husband, would curse me from heaven if that place burned down after all these years. Something warm flickered behind Ethan's ribs. Loyalty, devotion, memory. He understood all three. All right, he said finally. I'll stay. A few days. He didn't yet know those days would pull him into the quiet heart of Harbor Falls, into secrets, danger, and the fragile history of a town clinging to its last voice. As he helped her out of the truck, Ranger trotted ahead toward the radio shop door, tail raised, as though already taking up his post. Winter clouds thickened overhead once more. The next chapter of their lives had already begun. The shadow in the winter storm. The snow returned 2 days later, falling in slow, deliberate flakes that softened the rooftops of Harbor Falls and muffled the distant hum of the ocean. The cold was sharper now, carrying with it a kind of warning that Ethan felt in his bones. Winter in Maine never arrived gently. It crept in with intent. He spent most of the day repairing the narrow roofline of the radio shop. The shingles were warped, the beams thirsty for warmth, and the rusted antenna groaned every time the wind shifted. The work steadied him. Tools, patterns, measured breaths, these things made sense. Human intentions were far less predictable. Ranger patrolled the snow-dusted yard below. His thick black and tan coat stood out against the white ground, and the faint scar on his foreleg gleamed pale whenever he turned. Every so often he paused, ears pricking forward at some sound Ethan couldn't hear. The dog looked like a sentry carved from resolve itself. Inside the shop, Margaret Hayes settled herself at her small kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea. She looked stronger now, though still fragile, her cardigan wrapped tightly around her narrow shoulders. Her face carried that soft determination, unique to people who have already survived more than anyone expects. Her breath still rasped, but her eyes were clearer than when Ethan first found her lying on the floor. Throughout the day, Ethan heard snippets of conversation when he went into town for supplies. Locals at the cafe whispered the same name again and again. Victor Stanton. He was the kind of name people said quietly, with the tone of someone spitting out a lemon seed. Stanton was a real estate developer, wealthy, ambitious, and notoriously persistent. Locals described him as a tall man in his late 40s, clean-shaven with a narrow jaw and icy blonde hair always combed back like he was preparing for a magazine cover. His pale blue eyes were said to be sharp as sleet, the kind that measured people not by who they were, but by what they cost. Rumor claimed he had grown up poor in southern Maine, clawing his way into money through charm, pressure, and deals that always favored him. Some admired his tenacity, most didn't trust his smile, and now he wanted Harbor Falls. Specifically, he wanted the one piece of land that looked out over the bay, Margaret's shop. By dusk, Ethan could feel the cold tightening around town. He hammered in one more nail, then crouched low as the wind slapped the roof. Below him, Ranger suddenly stiffened. The dog's low growl rolled through the quiet yard like a warning from the earth itself. Ethan froze. Ranger's ears locked toward the alley behind the shop. Ethan slid quietly to the edge of the roof. His breath misted in front of him, and he narrowed his eyes through the curtain of snow. A figure stood near the gas tank behind the building, a tall man in a dark coat, a baseball cap pulled low. Even from a distance, something about his stillness felt wrong, coiled, intentional. The stranger's gloved hand rested near the gas line. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished into the veil of falling snow, footsteps swallowed by the storm. Ethan climbed down fast. Ranger met him at the bottom, fur bristled, ready for command. But the man was gone. By morning, the clues remained. The gas valve had been twisted. The electrical conduit near the back door had one clean cut. Neat, deliberate, not the jagged edge of age. Ethan crouched and touched the wiring. Cold, freshly exposed. His jaw tightened. Someone had been here with intent, and it wasn't to leave cookies. Inside, Margaret was sitting near the stove, warming her hands. Her voice was soft when Ethan told her. "I knew I heard something," she whispered. "Before I fainted that night. Heavy steps, metal, and a smell, like the burner had been left open." She set her cup down, fingers trembling slightly. "I thought it was my mind playing tricks." Ethan shook his head. "Someone was behind your shop last night, too." Margaret looked away, as if considering something she'd long feared taking shape. "Victor Stanton has been trying to buy this place for years," she said. "He sent letters, then people, then threats disguised as business offers." "Why this place?" Ethan asked. She smiled sadly. "Because Arthur built the first radio beacon here. Because this shop kept families safe through storms long before cell phones and apps. Because some things money shouldn't own. And he doesn't like hearing no." Ethan felt something cold stitch itself across his spine. The seal part of him, the part he tried to let sleep, woke a little. He moved through the shop, checking windows, testing the back door latch. Margaret followed with her slow steps. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. He didn't answer. He couldn't explain it, not fully. But something about the frail woman beside him stirred a long dormant instinct. Protection, duty. A quiet vow that rose from old embers. He installed a new deadbolt. He rewired the smoke alarms. He moved Ranger's bedding closer to the back door. When the final lock clicked into place, Margaret exhaled, a mix of relief and worry. "Ethan," she said softly, "you've already done too much." "No," he corrected gently, "not enough yet." Later that night, the storm strengthened. Wind clawed at the windows. Ranger lay in the dark near the door, ears twitching at every shift of snow. Ethan sat in a chair by the front window, the silhouette of a soldier carved against the pale glow of the street lamp outside. Somewhere beyond the storm, someone else was watching the shop. And Ethan knew this was no longer about a roof or a radio tower. It was about a battle someone had already brought to Margaret's doorstep. The night of the storm and the final signal. The storm reached Harbor Falls with a force that felt almost deliberate, as if winter itself had chosen this night to test the town's endurance. Snow slammed against the windows of the radio shop in frantic bursts, coating the glass until only blurred shadows remained outside. The wind shrieked down the narrow alleys, twisting around chimneys like a warning whispered in the language of ice. Inside, Ethan moved with steady purpose. Margaret sat bundled in 2 layers of sweaters, her thin frame swallowed by warmth, yet still trembling faintly, with each gust rattling the walls. Her white hair was braided loosely, the end tucked under her collar, and her pale face glowed softly in the lamplight as she watched Ethan reconnect the final wire of the transmitter. Her breathing remained shallow, but there was a spark in her eyes, a renewed life that came from having a task worth fighting through the pain for. Ranger circled the small kitchen before settling beneath the table. The German Shepherd's coat bristled every time the wind howled, and his amber eyes flicked between Ethan and the back door with unwavering focus. At 5 years old, he had the strength of a working dog, but the wisdom of one who had seen danger up close. He lay still, but tension ran through him like a taut wire. Outside, the storm swallowed the coastline in white. "Try the gain control," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse but resolute. Ethan adjusted the dial. The radio unit hummed, faint at first, then growing into a stable, low-frequency pulse. A tiny green indicator light blinked on. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, emotion catching her breath. "It's alive," she whispered. Ethan pulled the microphone toward him. The old metal casing felt cold under his fingers. With a deep breath, he pressed the button. "Harbor Falls, this is your local beacon. A severe winter front is crossing the coast. Roads are closed. Stay inside, keep heat to a minimum, and check on your neighbors." His voice carried through static, firm, and low. He continued speaking. Advice, warnings, small reassurances. Every few seconds the transmitter buzzed as the signal reached scattered homes across the hills. For a moment, the shop felt like a lighthouse, small, resilient, guiding others through a dark sea. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. "Arthur would be proud," she murmured. But the fragile peace lasted only minutes. Ranger's entire body stiffened. The dog rose from the floor in one smooth motion, ears sharp, muscles tight beneath his winter coat. His nose lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. Ethan stopped speaking mid-sentence. "What is it, boy?" Ranger growled. Quiet, deep, dangerous. A smell drifted into the room. Gasoline. Ethan set the microphone down silently. "Margaret," he said calmly, without turning, "I want you behind the counter. Right now." She did not question him. Something in his voice made her move faster than her frail body should have allowed. Ethan grabbed the small flashlight from the desk drawer and signaled Ranger to heel. They moved together across the dim shop floor, the storm's muffled roar pressing against the walls. A faint metal click sliced through the wind. Ethan pressed himself beside the kitchen doorway, slowly tilting the flashlight to illuminate the narrow gap between door and frame. A figure stood hunched near the gas tank outside, coat hood pulled up, face hidden in shadow. The man's gloved hand held a lighter. He fumbled, striking it once, sparking a small, dangerous flame. Ethan's pulse sharpened. He didn't think. He acted. He burst through the door in one explosive motion, snow and cold air rushing in like a tidal wave. Ranger lunged beside him with a ferocious bark, teeth bared. The intruder spun, startled, dropping the lighter. Ethan slammed into him, sending both of them crashing into the snow. The man was wiry, quick, stronger than his frail frame suggested. His clothes smelled of sweat and diesel. Underneath the hood, Ethan caught a glimpse. A sharp chin, narrow cheeks, dark stubble, eyes frantic with desperation. The stranger shoved hard, scrambling to his feet, boots slipping on ice. Ranger leapt, grabbing the man's coat sleeve and dragging him back just long enough for Ethan to stomp out the small flare beginning to lick the snow where the lighter had fallen. The man swung at Ranger with a clumsy elbow. Ethan surged forward, ready to restrain him, but the intruder tore free, ripping the coat sleeve right out of Ranger's jaw. He sprinted toward the alley. "Ranger, hold!" Ethan commanded. The dog froze, panting, watching the fleeing figure disappear into the storm. Something small dropped from the intruder's pocket as he ran, scattering onto the snow. Ethan bent to pick up the object, a laminated badge, Stanton Coastal Development, contractor access. His knuckles tightened around the card. This wasn't mischief. It wasn't intimidation. It was an attempt to erase the shop, erase Margaret, under the cover of a storm. Inside, Margaret waited near the radio desk, clutching her cardigan with trembling hands. Her eyes widened as Ethan tossed the badge onto the counter. "So, it's true," she whispered. "Stanton wants this place gone." Ethan didn't soften his voice. This wasn't a warning. It was a kill switch. Margaret inhaled shakily, but her chin lifted with a strength that defied her age. "Then we won't let him. Not tonight." The shop shuddered as the wind slammed against it again. Ethan stayed awake until dawn. Ranger remained by the door, a silent guard dog carved from vigilance. Margaret kept the radio alive, her voice soft between Ethan's warnings, telling old stories of Harbor Falls, reminding neighbors they were not alone in the storm. And out in the blizzard, somewhere unseen, the failed arsonist and whoever sent him realized their plan had not just failed, it had awakened a soldier. When the town answered the call, Harbor Falls woke beneath a sky washed pale by the passing storm. Snow blanketed every rooftop, every fence post, every dock beam stretching toward the frozen bay. The world looked soft, clean, reborn. Yet beneath that quiet beauty flowed a current of relief so strong it hummed like electricity in the cold air. No one had died. No fishing crew had gone missing. No elderly resident had been found frozen in an unheated home. People credited one thing: the old radio shop on the hill. Throughout the morning, Ethan accompanied Margaret as she moved slowly through the shop, leaning on his arm. Her steps were small, careful, but each one carried a quiet pride. The night before had nearly ended in disaster, yet here they were, alive, standing in the very place someone had tried to erase. Ranger followed at their heels, head high, as if aware of his newfound celebrity. News traveled quickly in small towns, and Harbor Falls was no exception. At the cafe, a cozy place run by Janet Lorne, a plump woman in her mid-50s with round glasses, curly auburn hair, and a laugh warm enough to melt frost, customers whispered excitedly about the mysterious voice on the radio. "That old shop saved half the town last night," Janet declared to anyone who would listen, wiping her hands on her apron as she poured coffee. "And did you hear the part where he warned about fallen lines on Harbor Road? could have been a disaster. Ethan, who had stepped in only to buy tea for Margaret, felt the weight of several gazes, some curious, some grateful, some whispering he must be the soldier folks were talking about, the quiet stranger with the dog. By noon, the praise buzzing in town had reached the wrong ears. Victor Stanton. The developer arrived at the town hall in a sleek black SUV, its tires crunching over the snow with an expensive certainty. Stanton himself stepped out, wearing a tailored charcoal coat, leather gloves, and a cashmere scarf draped neatly around a neck far too stiff to suggest warmth. His blonde hair, smoothed back with meticulous precision, didn't move even in the winter wind. His face was angular, handsome in a sterile way, cheekbones too sharp, eyes too cold, lips always arranging themselves into the kind of polite smile one uses when calculating a profit margin. Stanton had charm, certainly, but it was a charm that smelled faintly of polished glass and ambition. That afternoon, the community hall filled quickly. The building was modest, pine-paneled walls, creaking benches, a space that had hosted everything from Christmas recitals to lobster boat meetings. Now it buzzed with tension. Ethan helped Margaret inside, steadying her as she moved with small steps across the wooden floor. She wore a long wool coat the color of slate, and a knitted hat pulled low over her silvery braid. Age had thinned her voice, but her presence commanded respect in a way no microphone ever needed to. Ranger trotted. Beside them, earning delighted smiles from children and nods of approval from adults. Stanton stood at the front, hands folded, his blue eyes bright with forced optimism. "Good evening, everyone," he began in a smooth, rehearsed tone. "I know last night's storm was difficult, but Harbor Falls has an opportunity now. My development plan would bring businesses, jobs, a real future for this town." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Margaret lifted a folder of worn papers, yellowed, bent at the corners, tied with a thin ribbon. Arthur Hayes's handwriting lined each page, sharp and meticulous. With Ethan's help, she reached the front. "Mr. Stanton," she said, her voice thin but unwavering, "this land is not yours to take. It was promised by the founders of this town as a community station, a safeguard, a beacon. My husband kept that promise, and so have I." Ethan stepped forward, laying the contractor badge they had found in the snow onto the table. Gasps spread across the room like a gust of wind. "This," Ethan said, his baritone quiet but razor sharp, "was found behind Margaret's shop last night, alongside tampered wiring and an attempted ignition." Stanton's smile flickered. "This is absurd. You can't possibly—" "Some folks saw your trucks near the shop," a fisherman called out, standing. He was a big man in his 60s, with wind-chapped cheeks and a thick gray beard, and none of us appreciate being nearly blown to kingdom come. Another voice chimed in, the librarian, the mail clerk, even Janet from the cafe, each recounting what they had heard, seen, or felt the night of the storm. Even children raised their hands shyly to say they heard the radio warnings. Harbor Falls had spoken, and its voice was loud. Cornered, Stanton's polished certainty cracked. He tried to argue, to charm, to promise new benefits, but it was too late. The town council, a group of 5 residents led by Marion Pike, a petite woman in her late 60s with silver curls and a spine straight as a lighthouse beam, stepped onto the stage. Marion had a calm authority carved from decades as a school principal. "The people have spoken," she announced. "The radio shop stays. The development moves elsewhere." Cheers filled the hall. Within days, the community formed the Harbor Falls Radio Heritage Fund, dedicated to restoring the shop, maintaining equipment, and preserving its legacy as a beacon during storms. Margaret, still frail but glowing with purpose, spent her afternoons teaching volunteers how to use the equipment. Ethan accepted the council's offer to become technical and security coordinator. For the first time in years, he stopped planning his next departure. And Ranger, well, the children insisted he needed a title. They chose Chief of Winter Watch, and Ranger took the role with a solemn dignity that made half the town laugh. Winter began to loosen its grip. Snow remained, but the wind softened. Light returned to the bay. One early spring evening, Ethan sat before the microphone, adjusting the dials with practiced ease. His voice rolled warmly across the airwaves. "Good evening, Harbor Falls. This is the little radio shop on the hill. If you're hearing this, it means you're still here, and so are we." Ranger lay at his feet, tail thumping lazily. Margaret sat in her favorite corner chair, hands folded in her lap, a peaceful smile softening her face. A soldier, a dog, a 96-year-old woman, and the town that had taken them in. A story that had begun as a winter detour had become something else entirely, home. Some people say miracles arrive with thunder, but in places like Harbor Falls, they come in quieter ways. A soldier who stopped when he could have kept driving. A dog who listened to the wind before humans heard the danger. A 96-year-old woman who still believed a single voice could guide a whole town through the storm. Perhaps that is how God works most of the time, not in great signs or blazing fire, but in the small mercies that hold us together. A door opened at the right moment, a warning carried through the cold, a stranger who becomes family when the world feels harsh, and maybe, in the middle of our ordinary days, He is still planting these quiet seeds of grace, waiting for us to notice them, protect them, and share them with one another. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a reminder that hope still walks beside us. Leave a comment, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe so these stories of faith and second chances can continue reaching those who need them most. May God bless you, your home, and every path you walk. And may you always have eyes kind enough to see the miracles still hidden in plain sight.